Okay, so in the previous videos on monohybrid crosses, we talked about how we inherit eye color, and you should have had these little forms here all worked through. Okay, we start off with the genotype of the parent. We then take the somatic cells, we break it down into the gametes. We use the gametes to fill in a Punnett square, which gives us the genotype of the potential genotypes of the offspring. And then based on whether it is dominant or recessive, we can work out what the phenotype is, what that genotype would look like, and we can work out ratios. So we did that. I want to, before we move on to the next bit, any genetic cross is pretty straightforward and easy to do, so long as you know one thing, and it really is the most important thing. If you know the genotype, which alleles the parents have, then you can work out any genetic cross. So if something is, let me fix this a minute. Sorry, I just wrote the wrong word down. Okay, if something is homozygous, remember homo means the same. So if you are homozygous dominant for a specific characteristic, you will have that characteristic. How do you know something's homozygous dominant? You are going to see a big letter, right, a capital letter, followed by another big letter. So when we were talking yesterday about eye color, homozygous dominant for eye color in the example we used was brown eyes. And so we use big letter, big B, big B. So homozygous dominant, if you are homozygous dominant, you have inherited two dominant alleles from your parents. So something like big B, big B. It depends, you know, big W, big W, big N, whatever it is, it's going to be two capital letters. Okay. The next one that you have to know is, what if something is homozygous recessive? Okay. If it is homozygous recessive, that means that the individual has inherited the same alleles from both parents, and in the case here, they're homozygous. So how are we going to spot that? It's going to be a little letter or a lowercase letter followed by another little letter. Okay, so examples of that would be something like little b, little b, little w, little w, little n, two lowercase letters. Now, the other one that you need to know is, what if the parent has a heterozygous genotype? Okay, so if you have a heterozygous genotype, what that means, hetero, different, you've inherited different alleles from each parent. So what's that going to look like? You're going to have a big letter, okay, followed by a little letter. Okay, so in the example that we talked about yesterday, right, big B, little b, big W, little w, big N, little n. It doesn't matter what these letters are. You have a capital letter and you have a lowercase letter. Now, if you are heterozygous, what will that look like? You will have looks like the dominant, D-O-M-I-N-A-N-T, looks like the dominant allele. So big B, little b, you had a brown allele and a blue allele, but what color was the eyes? The eyes were brown. So if something's heterozygous brown, that means that the brown is dominant. If something, I don't know, in chickens, you can have straight feathers or frizzled feathers, right? If something is heterozygous straight feathered chicken, you know that straight feathers are dominant, because if you can't be heterozygous and have the appearance of the recessive allele. So these terms here are kind of important for you to kind of get your head around. If you understand these terms, all right, you can play detective on any genetic cross that we've done, and you can work out what you're going to get. So for the next assignment, you need to write this down, and this is going to go in your notebook on the next page. And then what you're going to do is you are going to take these problems, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, and you are going to take 2 of these papers, cut these in half, and so what it will look like in your notebook is this. I took the back paper that I cut in half, I took this, I stuck this down, and then I cut out a problem, and I did that 1, 2, 3, and 4. And this shows you the kind of the way to solve a problem. I'm going to work through one of these with you, and then the following 3 you are going to do yourself, and then here tomorrow or the next day I'll provide a key for you so that you know what you're doing. So I want you to look at this one here, and the first thing it says, I'm going to write this down, read it nice and well. It says, in certain breeds of dogs, deafness is due to a recessive allele, little d. So the first thing I know, I'm going to underline, because that's kind of important, recessive allele, so little d equals deaf, right? Normal hearing is due to a dominant allele, which is a big D. So I'm going to write big D equals normal. Always write out your letters. If you're not given letters, make your own letters up. It's absolutely fine. There's no rule about what letter you use. It's the combination of big and little, recessive and dominant that is important. The question says, what percentage of offspring, what percentage of the offspring of a normal heterozygous dog? Okay, so you're normal, you've got normal hearing, right? That means you have to have a big D, but you're heterozygous, so that must be the normal dog, right? The heterozygous dog, and a deaf dog. What's the only way you can be deaf? You have to have 2 little d's, so little d, little d. So based on the word problem, okay, I was able to work out what the genotypes of the parent dogs are, okay, and what would have normal hearing. So I know what my genotypes are. So I know that over here, this is going to be a big D, and this is going to be a little d. And I know here they're going to breed together, and this is going to be a little d, and this is going to be a little d. And this is the somatic cells, the body cells. So the next thing I need to do is I need to split these into gametes. And I'm not doing anything different than what we did when we were talking about eye color inheritance. So that one there is going to be a big D. That one's going to be a little d. That is going to be a little d. And that is going to be a little d. Okay, so now I've got the gametes. I'm going to put them into my Punnett square. So the big D goes there. The little d goes here. Over here, up at the top, I got a little d and I got a little d. And it's worth, when you write these down, make sure you make your letters clearly big and little so that you don't get confused and misread them. Box number 1, big D, little d. Box number 2, big D, little d. Box number 3 is going to be a little d and a little d, and box number 4 is going to be a little d and a little d. So now I have the genotypes of what we call the F1 generation. Basically, it's the kids of these parents, okay? So it's sometimes called the first filial. It's just the first generation. So I got big D, little d, big D, little d, little d, little d, little d, little d. Okay, so if I'm big D, little d, I've got a one dominant allele. I know big D was normal. So there is a chance for a normal hearing dog. And number 2 is the same. That is also a chance for a normal hearing dog. And because I wrote those down, I wrote down these here. There's no way I'm going to make a mistake on it. Little d, that's, all right, that is homozygous recessive, so that's going to be a deaf dog. Okay? And this one is going to be a deaf dog. So the question said, what percentage of offspring of a normal heterozygous dog and a deaf dog would be expected to have normal hearing, right? Normal, 2 out of 4, which is 50%. So there is a 50-50 chance that each puppy born would have normal hearing. What I want you to do now, using this as a guide, okay? Using exactly, this is exactly the way we did these ones. You have one about cats, right? If you're heterozygous long haired, that should tell you whether long hair is dominant or recessive. Then there's the one about the smooth haired and wire haired dogs. And then the last one you've got here is, and I just want to tell you this, predict the genotypic and phenotypic outcome. Genotypic and phenotypic, genotype, phenotype, right? If you've got 2 heterozygous tall pea plants, again, that should tell you whether tall is dominant or recessive. So go ahead, work the rest of those problems, and then I'll provide you with a key and then explain things just to make sure everybody's good as a follow-up.